Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Ronke Adequaju. I'm the director at BAYI Foundation. I have here with me Ian Henderson. He is one of our advisors, and welcome to A Day with a BAYI Advisor. Today, we'll be talking about trade finance and ESG. So, hello, Ian. Thanks for joining us.
Afternoon, Ronke. Afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be joining you today, and I look forward to sharing some of my views and experiences.
Great. So, Ian, in addition to being a senior portfolio manager at Gulf International Bank, you also volunteer as an advisor for at BAYI Foundation, and you have a wealth of experience in trade finance. Can you kind of tell us some of your experiences in trade and on commodities, particularly in Africa?
Oh, certainly, and I think, it's an interesting question because I've had so many varied experiences across the continent over a number of years. But I think if you sort of go back to when I first started traveling to Africa to meet banks in countries like Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, DRC, Zambia, at that time, there was a clear distinction between the foreign-owned banks and the local banks, and in turn, who was managing and running those banks. And it was evident where you had the foreign-owned banks, the senior management was comprised of expats generally. And then you had your local banks that may have had some different nationalities, but they weren't the same level of expats owning them. But what concerned me at the time was the lack of skill transfer and ensuring the succession planning was in place. That when at some point expats need to move on and local people should be holding those senior positions to have a better feel for the local market conditions and businesses. And whilst we saw maybe good platforms and infrastructure put in place from a risk and operations perspective, I'm not always sure the risk appetite and the way of doing business was correctly handled. And I think that led to a little bit of a gap between what a lot of institutions in the continent can provide versus where their foreign counterparties have got to over the last 20 years. There have been significant changes. I think we've seen changes amongst the banks across the continent. But for my mind, there is still a bit of a skills gap, and that obviously translates into getting money and resources to the right levels across the communities. Whereas if the people haven't got the right skills, there's no way you're going to get, that development and transfer taking place. But saying that, I think where you do see a lot of positives when it comes to trade finance is that trade finance is perfectly positioned to assist companies that might have limited balance sheets or limited equity. You're dealing in the goods themselves. You help with cross-border trade. So I think that's certainly a starting point. And a lot of the banks we met in my early days, and even more recently, where there's been a lot more training programs, more conferences to impart skills, get people using trade finance and other skills for funding businesses, that it's growing. And, now getting African banks and institutions up to first world standards in terms of anti-money laundering, know your customer, KYC compliance requirements, all of that's starting to be implemented. And in some countries, for example, in Liberia, they leapfrog technology and gone from having no systems and no processes in place to being in the region probably one of the leading banks. If you look at Liberia International Bank, one of the leading banks in having those services in-house, because they trained their people, they got the right training in place. And now when it comes to the compliance KYC AML side, really one of the best set of procedures I've seen from banks in Africa. So I think that opportunity exists in the continent, and that's on the banking side. I think when you then look to SMEs and commodity producers and sort of the trading end of the business, once again, characterized by much smaller players than you'd see in the international markets, much more fragmented. And I think that's where there's still a lot more development work to be done. I think we are starting to see blockchain and other technology starting to aid that process. Certainly if we look what happened with cell phones and mobile telephone technology, we could leapfrog fixed line technology and really start getting information into people's hands. I think now that people are used to using a mobile or PDA or smartphone, we're starting to see some amazing developments, from coffee exchanges in Ethiopia to, an upcountry cocoa producer in Nigeria knows what the cocoa prices are. He knows what his logistics costs are, and he has a much better negotiating tool with him. So the days where you had, very good local traders and commodity producers, and they were reliant on the international traders coming in to move their goods to the end markets, they created quite complicated supply chains. There was a lot of intermediation, and the farmer at the end of the day got very little for his cocoa, and all the profit was made in Switzerland or France or Germany, where the chocolate was made. I want to see that chain shortened and more benefits going to the farmers on the ground. So, further initiatives from the likes of Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliances, a number of the NGOs, all of these start having an impact on making sure, when we look at trade and particularly commodity finance, that profits are going back to the producers on the ground. So I think there's still a long way to go, but certainly over my time in operating in Africa, I've had a very positive overall good track record, very few defaults. Yes, we've had the usual delays, and we've had problems when there's been drought or heavy weather or port congestion, but ultimately these have worked out because people rely on getting these goods from A to B and ultimately shipping them to the end buyers. But on my side, I still think that there's a skills gap. I think people need to understand more on how trade finance works, so that people can empower themselves, and when they're negotiating with a bank or a foreign buyer, they can get better commercial terms for themselves. So I think that's certainly one of, when we talk about the BAYI Foundation, I know we'll talk about a little bit later on, providing more skills, giving people more confidence to broach these subjects and confidence in their commercial negotiations. That's really where we've got to get to. So, I've operated as a banker, I've operated as a trader, and now more recently acting as an investor. And you want to see these skills being imparted in all layers of the supply chain, and particularly in Africa.
Thank you, Ian. You've touched on quite a number of things here that I would like to go a bit deeper in. So, for example, you mentioned the skills gap in Africa, and this is definitely something that is an impediment to the growth and development of trade and commodities in Africa. So, a lot of, especially now with COVID, a lot of SMEs are now looking to expand and grow their businesses, but they just don't have the skills or the knowledge and support to do so. And they actually, some think it's something that is beyond their scale. Can you provide some advice to these SMEs that are looking to grow their business, especially now? And what kind of advice would you give them in terms of bridging that skill gap and getting them to look into international trade as a way of expanding their businesses?
Yeah, and I think it's a problem because, if you're an SME and you say, look, I've produced this shea butter, for example, and I want to ship it to maybe another African country or maybe to a European buyer, for example, and you've got the product, you maybe still have to fine-tune your packaging and design, but you have the basic idea. It's very difficult for that person or that entrepreneur to walk into a local bank and say, this is what I want to do, and get the right advice back. If anything, they'll say, look, we can't help you. That's not our job. What do you want? Do you want a letter of credit, or, we're not going to loan you the money? So I think when we talk about the skills gap, it's about going back to the start and saying, right, what is your business? What are you looking to sell? What are you looking to move, to where, how? And then work out what is required to do that. And once you've got that clear plan of action, maybe you can go to a local bank and say, look, I'm looking to sell my shea butter to a German buyer. How do I go about it? It's really working out, what does your commercial contract say? Do you have a commercial contract to start off with? I think when it comes to trade finance, it's all about making sure you can sell your product, but in return getting paid for that product. So the buyer wants to have delivery, and you as the seller, you want to make sure you get paid. And that's really what trade finance is about. And so I think, it's not a technical world. It's a very straightforward proposition. It's basic commerce in that, you want to sell and someone wants to buy. And it's how do you deliver and how do you get paid? And I think once you've worked out that mechanism, it's then easier to go to a funder or an investor and say, look, yes, I can sell my shea butter to Germany, but I need $50,000 to pack 3 containers, pay for the insurance and ship it to Germany. And I'm going to get paid under a letter of credit, or they'll give me an advance payment, or they'll pay me on arrival of the goods in Germany. As long as you've got that information, I think then you can go to a fund or investor and say, this is what I need, but you've got to have all of that information. So I think when it comes to the skills gap, it's about what are the questions to ask and what do I need to cover, and then have a firm plan, and then from there put it in place and start the process. So those are the early steps in this process that you have to take and make sure you've got in place.
Thank you, Ian. Last week, BAYI Foundation had a webinar for African SMEs where we had a representation of SMEs from different industries and sectors, especially manufacturing. And one of the topics that was being discussed was the perception made in Africa products have in the international and global markets. Some of these perceptions is that the products are substandard and not up to international levels. Can you comment on this perception and how African SMEs can overcome these impediments?
Yes, sure. I think Made in Africa is an important concept. I think it's a prejudiced view, to be perfectly honest, but I think as an SME or business owner, if you can sell your product in your local market, that's a good starting point. And I think that's where you have to develop your product. I think all too often in Africa, primary commodities have been exported, goods have been semi-finished, or raw materials have been exported without the added value or the manufacturing taking place in Africa. I think that certainly needs to change. We need to add more capacity for adding value, for doing more manufacturing, and manufacturing more finished goods and brands and products across the continent. There's no reason why it cannot be done. I think the technology exists, the people have the drive, the skills, and the inputs to do it. It's just getting that right combination. There are a number of success stories already out there and have become maybe not global brands, but they're globally successful, the products that are being sold in international markets. I think quite often the perception starts back at home, unfortunately, where a local product may be competing with an imported product from Europe or the US. And I think that perception has to change. And as I said, maybe through this COVID crisis where we've seen supply chains disrupted, and people in various countries have not had imported goods and they've had to live and use domestic products and realize they're just as good, if not better in many cases, that mindset has to start changing. So the next step from there is develop a good local market, then a regional market, start exporting on an intra-African basis, and then try and break into some of the global markets. And it largely depends on the type of good that we're speaking about. But for example, we know that certain copper products and metal products that are manufactured on the continent get shipped far and wide to the Far East, to Europe, to Latin America. There's no reason why cosmetics, garments, we looked at the AGOA projects that were in place, particularly for the garment industry, where there was semi-finishing done of clothing and textiles in Africa and then exported to the US for finishing. Why can't the finished product be done in Africa as well? So I think it's really looking at what's being done and just taking it a step further. And when people realize that, there's a sustainable supply chain, that there's no slave labor, that there's no child labor, sort of addressing some of the ESG principles in your product, that it's sustainably made and it's fit for purpose, these products will sell in the international markets. I think there's a greater awareness. I think certainly on the global level where we've seen supply chains disrupted, people are looking at where their goods are coming from, how complicated are their supply chains. And I hope that's an opportunity where on the African continent, can put our hands up and say, we can make those products, we can ship them to you. You don't need to send the raw materials from Africa to China and then back to the US or back to Europe. Let's manufacture them on the continent. So I think that's where one of the SMEs in the webinar last week spoke about some of the products that they fought long and hard to get them into international markets, and its perseverance does pay off. But once people start using those products, they see they stand up to scrutiny, are just as good as anything else made abroad. The other thing is, I think, just making sure from health and safety, product quality, that the consistency is there, that if you need any certifications, that those are put in place. And I think, people like Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, and other certifications that are necessary for goods maybe going into Europe or the US. If you've got those certifications, then there's no reason why your goods won't sell in those markets. So I think it's not only about selling your goods abroad, it's really what we use back at home in Africa, and making sure that let's use more local and let's try and champion the made in Africa. We're seeing this nationalism in all markets at the moment, and there's no reason why Africa shouldn't take advantage of that opportunity as well.
Thank you, Ian. My next question is on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is an agreement that has been signed by almost all the 54 African countries, and I think this was signed in 2018, and we are expecting some great benefits from this agreement in the coming years. Can you kind of give us some of the expectations and the outlook of the impact of this Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement on the African continent?
I'm not an expert on the agreement itself, but I think, one of the challenges in getting this agreement signed was just to try and get some consensus. Because, in the past, you had SADC, you had COMESA, you had the West African treaties, and they all had slightly different constructs and objectives. I think by trying to get the continent-wide free trade agreement in place, is just to try and get that consistent approach across the continent to encourage more intra-regional trade, more intra-African trade. And I think if we can get that working under this agreement, that's a great start. All too often, the other agreements resulted in one country importing or having goods dumped and then those being smuggled cross-border. Those are the sort of things you've got to try and prevent by having this continent-wide agreement in place. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to harmonize financing or taxes and tariffs yet. I think there's still a long way to go in that sense. You obviously got huge differences and discrepancies between currencies and currency strength, and that will persist for some time. But I think it's a start, and it's getting the continent to speak with one voice and not a fragmented voice, trying to get regions cooperating as well. So in my mind, it's a step in the right direction. I still think it's got a long way to go. So I think we all have high expectations, but it's going to take a lot of work at all levels, whether it's at sovereign, whether it's at institutional, and even down to small SME level where you're pushing up from the bottom to make sure things do get done. Otherwise, I fear it might drift, whilst there's so many other pressures and challenges on the continent that we're facing at the moment. So I just hope the COVID pandemic hasn't thrown this into the back burner, and that the initiatives continue being pushed. I know certainly African Development Bank, Afrexim Bank, they are working with the African Union and others to ensure that this starts being rolled out, and that the financing schemes put in place are in line with this free trade agreement as well.
Thank you, Ian. And my last question would be on the environmental, social, and governance goals, ESG.
ESG is still relatively new and being adopted at early stages in parts of Africa. I think it's gathering pace very, very quickly. 3 or 4 years ago, not everyone knew what ESG was. I think certainly in the last couple of years, ESG has been spoken about not only by institutional investors, and when you look at equity portfolios or bond portfolios, but now all the banks are adopting ESG principles and policies. The shareholders and investors in these banks and pension companies and insurance companies want to make sure that where their money goes at whatever level, ESG is part and parcel of that process. So it's being driven by investors. I think there's a role to play that as a business owner, you implement ESG policies as well. It certainly contributes to sustainability and has a positive impact on growth and viability in the long run. And people mustn't say, oh, it's just for the first world, or it's just for developed nations, or it's only for institutions. Even as an SME, I think you have to start embedding some ESG principles into your business. And, not everything needs to be accommodated. The ESG, environmental social governance framework, can look at the sustainable development goals. There's 15 different topics and you can just have a couple that fit with your business or specific themes that you think are important to your business. But certainly as a business, if you've got governance as part of that process being looked at, so that you're looking at your employment policies, your gender diversity, your quality, that you have proper governance in terms of corruption and bribery, fair employment principles, health and safety, financial reporting, having your financials audited, making sure your taxes are up to date. All these small things start building a very positive picture for the business. From there, you can look at what other social impact you have as a business, what other environmental elements you have as part of your business. So you might find you're using recycled materials, that even in your own day-to-day operations, you have light-saving light bulbs, you don't waste paper, you recycle water in your business. So all these small little elements that you can put in, if you formalize them and document them somewhere or have a proper ESG policy, that goes a long way and becoming a lot more attractive to outside investors, institutional investors, even bankers and funders these days want to see if you've got an ESG policy in place. So I don't want people to view it as unnecessary regulation. It's not regulation. ESG should be driven by your own wish and ethos and willingness to have, best in class for your own business. So as a business owner, it should be something you want to achieve and put in place. And it shouldn't be something being forced upon you by an external party. It should be something that comes naturally from within the business.
Thank you, Ian, for that amazing conversation on trade and commodities in Africa. To learn more about trade finance, please apply to our business support program. It starts September 2020, and Ian would actually be taking the online course on trade finance, and you can learn a lot more about his wide range of experiences in and around Africa. Thanks for joining us today, and do have a wonderful day. Goodbye.